And good morning.
Good morning.
Look, it's happening. We are, in fact, live. The dog, he scoots out of the way,
Noah's live too.
which is kind of, I'm just going to say a little miracle because,
Yeah.
he's mostly Great Dane.
The immortal great door.
He's almost 13. Okay, so we'll give you a moment to gather together, gathering, because, we were a scooch late getting it together.
Imagine
Um,
that.
do you want to maybe slide on up? You look like you're way in the back there.
Sure. You're gonna do a tarot, and we'll have the whole thing. Yeah.
Just like always.
Just like always.
But for now, we'll give you a minute, and Teresa will entertain you.
I will. Okay.
Isn't that what you usually do, dear?
Well, this gives me a chance to talk to you about back in the day.
What about Doan's liver bills?
Hey.
Carter's liver bills.
When I was young, a long time ago, prehistory. Let's see who's here. Anybody here yet? Nope. Nobody here. Hello, nobody. And if you have just tuned this in, let me explain. You'll probably want to skip ahead a little bit until Ani reappears and the toys go away, because this is how we do it. We do a live broadcast, and to give people a chance to gather together, we just put little tin toys in front of the camera and let them rattle. So that's what I'm going to do here. It's the same old tin toy. And I might wind up the clock too. I like wind up things. This is how this happens. So when we get ready, in about probably 2-3 minutes, this is now Bridge to a Better World. And I'll explain more in a minute. But I'll give you a peek that we have a couple of headlines, and then I'll be talking about Oligarchy. Go, little tin toy. Right now it is a few minutes after 9 a.m. Let's see if this thing tells me what exactly. No, it doesn't. Let's see, I've got 9:03 Pacific. I'll put that up there. 4 o'clock. I put notification on Twitter. Even though, many of my friends have fled Twitter, and on Instagram. Or I tried to put on Instagram. I'm not sure I understand what I'm doing with Instagram. Let's see, I'm looking at Julie's Shoe Repair, JD Shoe Repair, and the news left BMW. That's encouraging. There's a post that has to do with more threats against queers, against people like me who are a little different. I am obviously a trans woman, emphasis on the woman, and let's see. News left PMW says, in the midst of escalating violence against LGBTQ folks over false groomer rhetoric from right wingers, whose leaders in churches consistently get caught or investigated for sexual abuse against minors, Renton, Washington faces a terror threat from members of the right wing in the area threatening an event. Fortunately, no one is inside at noon. When the shooting occurred, the employees placed the sign next to the bullet hole. Since I'm on the inner tubes here, And I'd like to comment on that, which is fuck you, right wingers. I can certainly shoot back, and I will if I must. So stop that shit. Shooting proves nothing. Here we go. Good morning, John.
Good morning, one and all. Shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
No time like the present.
And there's no present like the time.
And in fact, now is all you have.
Wherever you're at, that's where you are.
Just so.
Platitudes are us. No, that's not what this is called. This is called
This is
now Bridge to a Better World. And I am Teresa Mitchell.
I'm Audie.
Style myself Tiresias, and that is Audie Reagan as well.
You style yourself Tiresias.
Yes.
Cool.
This is how I style. Because Tiresias was a seer who was turned by Zeus into a woman for 7 years.
Into a lawn?
Into a woman.
Oh, a woman.
Or a lawn, if you like.
I was like, Zeus turned somebody into a
She
lawn?
worked as a lawn woman. Not. Okay.
I wouldn't worry so much about the boom next time. Okay.
Hello,
Pardon.
thanks for tuning in. Okay, so we have some things to say, and I want to start with some headlines. Do you have a headline?
No.
Or just go with mine? Okay.
I've been
Sometimes you surprise me. It's like, oh, there's a headline.
Not since I had COVID. For those of you who may be new or may have forgotten, usually we alternate headlines, and I also participate in some analysis of news. But for the last 2 months, in fact, I've been totally sick and not really focused in any kind of direction like that. So,
Yeah,
but
so
I
I've been
do
picking
get up early enough to get the computer started for Teresa.
Yes. She is, she's concentrating on breathing, which is a good thing to do.
I like breathing.
It's consistent practice.
But you
breathing.
carry on now with the
so I'll
news
pick
and
up some
stuff.
slack. Yeah. Okay. So here is the first headline: Oregon hospitals are crammed with the sufferers of the COVID, RSV, flu triple-demic, and capacity is even more strained now than during the worst of the COVID-only pandemic. Oh, for the days of the COVID-only pandemic. OPB, KGW, the Idaho Capital Sun Bulletin, and other sources report capacity is 95% taken up in Oregon hospitals, not for lack of physical beds, but due to staffing shortages. Oregonians are being urged by medical providers to wear a mask to help reduce the strain of emergency room and hospital staffs. Speaking for the Oregon Health Authority, Wendy Hassan of Legacy Emmanuel said, quote, masking works anytime you have to go to an indoor crowded area during this surge. If you and your child can wear a mask, that will help protect the healthcare resources, end quote.
Yeah, please mask up, people. As somebody who has used the emergency room services, I guess the last time was on Thanksgiving. It's busy. It's so busy, and the nurses are ran ragged. The doctors are ran ragged. I had some very interesting conversations with them about staffing shortages and about how horrendous it has been to work under the conditions that folks have had to work under for the last 2.5 years since this pandemic really swooped in. Also, just to point out, the triple epidemic, as it were, is made worse. I mean, the RSV and flu are both made much worse this year by the fact that many of us have had COVID, and COVID wrecks our immune system. So we are more susceptible to becoming sick and getting sicker than we may have been in the past. Also, of course, there are just a ton of studies coming out now that say the more often you contract COVID, the higher the incidence or the higher the chance of you coming down with some of the nastier long COVID symptoms, long COVID effects are. So to the extent possible, do our precautionary things, right? Wear your masks, keep your distance, and try not to be in crowded indoor places so much.
They're such sweethearts.
Also, all the vaccines. Get them.
Seems the least we can do is wear masks. Writing in the unfortunately turf-friendly Guardian, George Monbiot, a well-known social critic, has taken the U.S. government and society to task over its mealy-mouthed refusal to deal with the climate emergency. He writes, quote, "Through its undemocratic dominance of global governance, the U.S. makes the rules to a greater extent than any other state. It also does more than any other to prevent both their implementation and their enforcement. Its refusal to ratify treaties such as the Convention on Biological Diversity provides other nations with a permanent excuse to participate in name only. Like all imperial powers, its hegemony is expressed in the assertion of its right not to care," end quote, which I think is expressed pretty well. And that is the power is the theme of today's show. I have comments about oligarchy. We live in an oligarchy. That's a fact that is plain to some and obscured from most. There's much talk of democracy. I like to talk about democracy now, I say. But if democracy held sway in this country, it would not be so difficult to move policy in a way that benefits the masses. And in fact, the idea of benefiting the masses is inculcated really as anathema. And we are taught instead to attack each other in various ways, mostly, but not entirely economic. And for those who say, oh, never mind the culture wars, the important thing is, class war or whatever. Well, I agree, except that you really can't afford to ignore the culture wars unless you want to see people like me put in camps, because that's where we're headed. We are becoming Untermenschen, and our oligarchs greatly fear democracy breaking out, and they want this sort of infighting to go forward. Doesn't mean that it's not important, but it does mean that it issues from the oligarchy. And in the recent rail fight, the corporate-owned press was careful to frame the issue as workers versus national survival, rather than workers versus insanely greedy, insanely rich owners who wouldn't even give them a lousy 7 days a year to get sick in a pandemic. We are encouraged to think of a mere rational concession like a puny 7 days a year for sick pay as unreasonable and unthinkable. This is, of course, quite unpopular. But that doesn't matter much in an oligarchy that controls the press. It is only necessary to lie about it and to change the subject. So we have President Joe Biden signing the legislation to crush the rail unions while constantly saying he is pro-labor. He'll keep repeating that.
And he loves trains.
Oh, he loves trains, and he'll repeat that, and so will the shills for corporate America until people believe it or we forget about it and go on to something else. And these policies that the railroads are pushing aren't just bad for labor. They're bad for anyone near the train tracks because they want to cut down on personnel and automate everything until derailments become routine and a cost of doing business. They don't care if they wipe out a whole town with a chlorine spill. The insurance will cover their costs. That's war on you and me and profit for them, private jet trips for shopping, and Lamborghinis for their sons. The oligarchy, via its war-making arm, the Central Intelligence Agency, whose multi-billion-dollar budget is a secret even to Congress, decided more than 8 years ago that they want to make war in Ukraine. Now, we're not supposed to talk about that. Hey, settle down, Skinner.
He just settled.
Okay, well, that's good. But this isn't a show for people who can't handle truth and subtlety. Not that there is much subtle really about what I just said. Don't worry. I support the right of all people to make their own societies and repel invasion. That's why I reject the invasion of Ukraine. It's true, Putin was expertly and persistently provoked. But one may choose one's response to provocations, and collective punishment of an entire nation via invasion is not a morally supportable choice. And for those who say, well, they're Nazis, that's not true either, is it? There's definitely a foul salting of Nazis in there, and there are far too many people who tolerate it. But the Nazis were pushed on them, frankly, by the CIA. That's just a fact. It's a historic fact. Sometimes you have to go to sources like Covert Information Bulletin to find the details, but that's how the war started. As I've said,
I'm just going to throw in from the sideline because I'm feeling sassy, apparently. There are Nazis, I'm going to say, could also be used here.
I guess does, yeah.
Because as the January 6th committee is turning up, there seems to be some unholy intermingling of those with, Christian white nationalist identities and our power structures, especially our, enforcement arms, call it cops and security agencies.
Yep.
Carry on.
Yeah, and we have to take measures against them in the extreme. And yet, with this logic, an invasion would be justified against us. As I've said many times over the past decade via cable radio and now on other platforms, the CIA chose to arm and organize several right-wing and pro-Nazi militias in Ukraine. They were already present to some degree as a result of the Cold War and drew their anti-Russian credentials back to the Second World War and Stepan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator. After the better part of a year, considering the context of my mistake, I can see why I thought the Russians would not bother to invade and why it was inevitable that they actually would. And I have to give credit in the way of giving the devil his due to the McLean provocateurs and their multi-billion-dollar, multi-year effort to make a terror army out of right-wing Adar, C-14, Azov, and all the other fascist gangs. They succeeded by continually harassing the Donetsk and Luhansk republics and convincing Putin that he had a right and an obligation to invade. And I can see now that the invasion has aspects of a civil war. It isn't a civil war, but because the Ukrainian borders weren't theirs, but there are decades of history as part of the former USSR to complicate matters. Now we are waging an ongoing war in Europe. There are a few Americans present as of now, just advisors, as the corporate press said during the beginnings of the Vietnam conflict. But the war is changing. It's clear that Putin thought he could roll into Kyiv without much pushback, framing the action as just punishment for brothers and sisters siding with the enemy, family that could be perhaps brought back to the table after a period of chastisement. Now he has chosen near total war to avoid the humiliation of losing a conflict that he chose. It's all madness. I want to be clear about that, but it will be horrifying to see how far he will go. He's already engaging in anti-civilian warfare, and his missiles and artillery are knocking out the power grid to the entire country, knocking out the water, which is a horror. I mean, it's like an earthquake. He's a Muscovite and knows just how cruel winter is going to be now. What will he do next? Begin bombardment with cluster bombs? Will he hit the bomb shelters as the Americans did with Al-Mariyah shelter in Baghdad, or genocide entire cities as the Americans did in Fallujah? Whatever he does, we will be paying taxes for a long time to cover the cost of opposing it. And as always, should the war end on favorable terms for the Americans, corporate America will be there to snap up the land, labor, and whatever blood-dripping assets seem profitable. Corporate America made bank on Iraq, though they were thwarted from the oil, tin, rubber, rice, and labor of Vietnam. Of course, the war munition suppliers make money either way. Our information sources have changed since the Vietnam War, when a correspondent for the major news services could get the effective rank of lieutenant for the purposes of getting on a boat or a helicopter for coverage. The reactionaries blamed the press for losing that war, a pattern that goes on today. So the corporate news, which was perfectly well slanted before and during Vietnam, is now utterly dependent on Pentagon propaganda for any war coverage. We don't get war coverage, and Ukraine is not going to open up either. So I was pleased to see Boris Kagarlitsky, an honest dissident who reported on Yeltsin's crimes even as he was being bombed by Yeltsin inside the Russian parliament. He was on Democracy Now! Talking to Nermain Sheikh. He said, for example, referring to the trade of Victor Bout, an arms dealer demonized by the West, quote, "I don't think it is a major news item for the Russian public because people are much more worried and more interested in following what happened recently when supposedly Ukrainian drones managed to reach some airfields inside Russia, very deep inside Russia, like in the Saratov region. So they attacked an airfield, a military airbase, where they managed supposedly to damage a few strategic bombers, which shows the outreach for Ukraine forces in terms of bringing the war back to Russia is getting much, much more serious. So that is really the news which is discussed in Russia. And that is really very important because it really brings the war back, so to speak, back to the doorsteps of Russian households, end quote. Finally, some untainted insight. Boris also said the Russian people who were fairly apathetic about the war are being driven to oppose it due to the draft, noting that twice as many as were drafted left the country. He said that Russia was obviously losing the war, but his framing was interesting after that, as he spoke of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics as Russian protectorates. In this quote, however, the situation now is getting much worse because in Ukraine, there are some radical voices which are saying that they have to get further into Crimea and into Donetsk and Luhansk republics, which, as you know, which are separatist republics, which declared their independence as early as 2014. And Crimea, as we know, was annexed by Russia also in 2014. So, well, as you see, Putin started with a claim to get new territories, integrate new territories into the Russian Federation. Now there is a danger of losing what they already used to have before the beginning of the war, and this is definitely a disaster for Putin and for his regime, end quote. So if even Kagarlitsky is talking in those terms, and of course he's speaking disapprovingly, and yet he frames it as these republics are separate, he does not even consider Donetsk and Luhansk effectively part of Ukraine. Not that they are anymore, mind you, since 2014 and the Minsk Accords. You can be sure the Russian government, which is vastly more of that mindset than a long-term dissident, does not intend to give up those territories and will defend them. So despite the idea that Russia has lost the war, there is absolutely no end in sight, as Kyiv and Washington both designate those republics as Ukrainian soil, as well as the Crimean Peninsula, where the Russian Black Fleet is historically docked. I can hear that Ozzy the Cat agrees that this is a wretched situation. Washington is ready to fight to the last dead Ukrainian and beyond. What a horror. But foreign wars aren't the only thing profitable to oligarchies. It's also important to them to be continually making war on democratic participation here in the US for the simple reason that they are the elites and elite rule, and only continual confusion and disarray in the general population can maintain their transparently unjust rule. So they have paid literally millions of dollars, 90 million by one observer's count, to subvert the Supreme Court. Trump appointee dominated SCOTUS, which has destroyed a woman's right to control her own body in the conservative states, is now looking at legitimizing religious rule over GLBTQIA persons and throwing control of state-chosen presidential electors to the bought-off conservative state legislatures. And by the way, it's easy to
It's time for great concern.
Yes, it was easy for the Koch networks to buy off the state legislatures because they are composed of representatives from various counties and districts around states, and many of them are rural. So they're able to take backwater and frankly backwards areas, pay them off, raise hell against trans women, and get these reactionary fools to dominate the legislatures, which they now want to run the country. Arguably, the Republican control of the House of Representatives today can be laid to SCOTUS, to the Supreme Court of the United States' refusal to enforce the Voting Rights Act. Meanwhile, there is a tiny amount of pushback in the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee, which held a hearing including an ex-Supreme Court lobbyist and now whistleblower, Reverend Robert Schenck. Reverend Schenck told the committee about how his decades-long influence campaign, aimed specifically at Supreme Court justices, successfully and intentionally exploited the High Court's lack of meaningful ethics and transparency rules. They should be talking to Jenny Thomas about her massive reactionary politicking and fund distribution scheme, although they're not yet, and they should know just how much she lobbies her husband, Justice Thomas, but that's for another day, if ever. Conservatives aren't known for grasping subtleties. So I argue if the court rules in favor of GLBTQIA hating evangelicals seeking to legitimize their bigotry as protected religious rights in the frame of artistic expression, they won't get it. They won't care. People like me, an easily clocked trans woman, will need the equivalent of a green book to navigate through conservative towns and buy gas and lodging and avoid conflict. Likewise, if they buy the argument that state legislatures aren't even controlled by the state constitutions that generated them, it will be possible for them to pick the next president by ignoring state laws about electors. And that's what's afoot in the Supreme Court right now, of course. I mean, we saw it coming, and the real, most recent crisis, I won't say the crisis, the most recent crisis was, of course, the election by not popular vote by the anti-democratic electoral college of President Trump. And we're still suffering from that and will be for a long time. So that's what I have to say about the current situation. Down with the oligarchy. And don't kid yourself that we live in a democracy. We still have some democratic controls, and they're much hyped to make you think that we have democracy, but we most certainly do not. And we need to fight for it. Thanks for your time.
All right.
That's what I have to say.
That is what you have to say, is it? I agree.
And that's what Ozzy has to say. Meow. Meow.
And, I am hoping to do more in the future. I am starting to feel a little bit better. I say cautiously.
It's easily cat equivalent of people you see down in Burnside. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Morning, Jabara.
I think that is questionable at best in appropriateness. Okay. So what I have for our tarot this week, oh dear viewers. So for the community for the week, here are some themes to consider. We are powerful, right? It is important to look around and assess where you can make a difference, assess where your personal power really is, and how you can leverage it to, in fact, help yourself and your community. There's a lot of creative potential, and you are a leader. You have enough fortitude, enough experience, enough strength to really apply leadership in the community, in your immediate environs at this time. So check yourself out, notice where your strengths are, and at the same time, the struggle is real, you at this point have you may be experiencing some fatigue. You might be a little tired because, in fact, you are a powerful person. You've done a lot, and this card, it's the 10 of Wands, and it's really talking about um, having reached a lot of understanding about your own will. You've honed your will, and you've come through a lot of hardship, and and you may be tired, right? Accordingly, but it's also part of what has made you powerful. So take stock again of what you have. Be careful with your resources. Uh, but also, I mean, and when I say careful with your resources, I mean it's not really the time to just squander energy and physical resources. It is the time, in fact, to um, talk, to really be real with how much you can take on right now and what there is to share around. Do not deplete yourself. And then we have we call it the 7 of Cups. This is a card taken with the other two to be careful about fooling yourself. Be careful about fooling yourself. Be careful about not uh, being realistic in your assessment of where your skills are, where you can lead, and where you can share. There's a lot of opportunities around, and it's sort of this is a card of kind of being lost in your head sometimes, and maybe not having uh, the clearest ideas because there's a lot of wish fulfillment happening, a lot of daydreaming. There's a good place for that. It's important, in fact, to daydream. It's important, in fact, to vision. But it's also important to be pretty grounded when you're taking a good assessment of how much energy you have and what direction you want to go. So, and finally, the card to kind of watch out for, it's the 5 of Cups. And, it just sort of, it popped out of the deck. I usually just draw 3 cards. And so this card was like, watch out for me. It's sort of a challenge, if you will. It could be a challenge this week. And the 5 of Cups talks about kind of not seeing the forest for the trees, getting caught up in disappointment, and missing good opportunities that could be right there around the corner, or not seeing how something that has, like right now, it looks kind of disappointing, but if you really drill down, it could be a very good thing that's happened. Something that is frustrating, something that brings sadness, maybe, but maybe it's just a part of the process and it's time to look at other opportunities. Sometimes I look at that as like a relationship that's ran its course. It might be sad to leave it, but better things are waiting for you. A job that you have gotten used to and it's comfortable, but it's not really fulfilling you, or in fact, it's degrading you, and it's time to move on. It's something like that. There's disappointment afoot. Uh, but don't get caught up in it. Don't miss the opportunity that is there in the same hand. And so that's the reading I have for this week. Um, in sum, assess your personal power. See where you can influence good decisions in your immediate circles. Um, know that you have attained a lot of wisdom. You can share that, but also be careful about depleting yourself emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, and physically. You've gained a lot from your own hard work. Um, so use your gains wisely, and be realistic with the expectations about yourself, and always look for the opportunity around the corner. Don't get too caught up in disappointment this week. And with that, that's what I have.
You have a kind of Taoist attitude to that sort of thing, I think.
Probably.
Set back like, oh, my son has broken his leg. Oh, but look, he didn't get drafted.
Yeah, well, I think that is my philosophy. One can never say truly what's bad or good because we don't see the ripples that our actions create often through their completion. So, every act we take influences our world. So this is a week where I encourage you to really check out your personal power and act in accordance with your alignment, with your core values, and take care of yourself and each other. Always look for the silver lining as well.
I see from the comments about Warnock that Warnock won, which is a great thing. It reminds me that this morning I saw that Cinema has declared she is now an independent.
Yeah, and I believe it was Congressman from New York, Jamal, whose last name escapes me at this moment, tweeted "Bye, Felicia." I kind of, I kind of like that. All right, so with that, we'll see you next week, right?
Thanks for tuning in.
And thank you so much. Do hit the subscribe if you have not already subscribed. Hit the subscribe, hit the notification bell, and do like this video. Thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to study tarot or other witchy things with me, please do get a hold of me in any of the social medias. You can find us in the Twitterverse. We are Bridge numeral 2 Utopia. And that's Bridge to Utopia. In the Twitterverse, you can DM me there. You can also find me Ani_Raven in the Twitterverse. You can leave comments here, of course, on the video. And yeah, like that. Thanks so much for your attention this morning or whenever you're viewing this. Take good care. We'll see you in a week.
Our love goes out to you and to all the ships at sea. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Love y'all. Boop.